The first rock struck Lillian Morrison's back as she exited the general store, the impact nearly causing her to drop the precious sack of flour she just spent her last coins on. She didn't need to turn around to know who had thrown it. The jeering laughter of Hank Pritchard and his friends told her everything. "Look at her waddle," Hank called out, his voice carrying across Newton's dusty Main Street, like a duck trying to carry a boulder. Newton, Kansas in 1878 was a town that had seen its share of cattle drives and railroad expansion. But for all its supposed progress, it remained cruelly stagnant in its treatment of those who didn't fit the mold. Lillian, at 22, had lived there her entire life, watching as the town grew around her while she remained forever on its outskirts, not because of where she lived, but because of who she was. "Just keep walking," she muttered to herself, clutching the flour tighter against her chest. Her pale blue dress, one she'd sewn herself to accommodate her fuller figure, was now marked with dust from the rock. She'd need to wash it tonight, though the fabric was already wearing thin from too many scrubbings. "Hey, Morrison," Hank shouted again. "My pa says you broke the boardwalk last week. Says the town ought to charge you extra for repairs." Fresh laughter erupted, and Lillian felt her cheeks burn. She hadn't broken anything, she'd simply stepped on a loose board that had already been damaged by the spring rains. But in Newton, every mishap that occurred within 50 feet of her became her fault, a consequence of what they called her unnatural size. "Miss Morrison." The voice came from her left, deep and unfamiliar. Lillian didn't want to stop, didn't want to give Hank and his friends the satisfaction of seeing her engage with anyone, but something in the tone made her pause. A tall man leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon. He wasn't from Newton. She would have remembered him. His dark hat cast shadows across his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, the broad shoulders beneath a dust-covered duster coat. A cowboy, by the look of him, probably passing through with one of the herds. "Miss Morrison," he said again, pushing himself away from the post and taking a step toward her. "Would you allow me to escort you home? These streets don't seem particularly friendly at the moment." Another rock skittered past her feet, accompanied by more taunts from Hank's group. "Look, she's found herself a blind man," one of them called out. The stranger turned his head slightly toward the voice, and something in his posture changed. Whatever the young men saw in his face made them fall silent, their laughter dying in their throats. I don't need an escort," Lillian said softly. "But thank you." "The name's Gabriel Logan," he said, removing his hat to reveal sandy brown hair and clear green eyes that regarded her with unexpected warmth. "I just rode in yesterday with Mackenzie's herd from Texas. And while you might not need an escort, I'd appreciate the company all the same." He smiled, and fine lines appeared at the corners of his eyes. "It's a mighty lonely thing being new in town." Lillian hesitated. She wasn't accustomed to kindness from strangers, especially not handsome ones who looked to be in their early 30s, and had the kind of confidence that came from years on the open range. "They won't stop," she warned him quietly. "Once you're seen with me, they'll talk about you too." Gabriel Logan's smile didn't falter. He stepped closer, and she noticed his right hand bore a thin scar that ran from knuckle to wrist. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I've faced cattle stampedes, flash floods, and men with guns drawn. I reckon I can handle a few small-minded folks with rocks and not much else." When she didn't immediately respond, he added, "Besides, it's the decent thing to do. My mother would tan my hide, even from the grave, if she knew I'd left a lady to walk alone while fools threw stones." Lillian couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "It's the end of Cedar Street," she said finally. "The small house with the blue door." Gabriel nodded and fell into step beside her. He didn't offer to take her flour sack, which she appreciated. She wasn't helpless, just hated. But he did position himself between her and Hank's group, his tall frame effectively shielding her from any more projectiles. As they walked, Lillian was acutely aware of the contrast they must present her, in her homemade dress that strained at the seams despite her best efforts, and him, lean and trail-hardened, moving with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. "How long have those boys been troubling you?" Gabriel asked after they'd gone a block in silence. Lillian gave a small, bitter laugh. "Those boys, their fathers before them, this whole town, all my life, Mr. Logan, all my life." Gabriel frowned but said nothing more as they turned onto Cedar Street. The houses here were modest compared to those on the north side of town, but most were well kept, with small vegetable gardens and the occasional splash of wildflowers. Lillian's house stood apart not because it was neglected, but because the wildflowers grew in profusion around it, creating a riot of color that defied the dusty brown palette of Newton. "You have a way with growing things," Gabriel observed as they approached. "They don't judge," Lillian replied simply. When they reached her gate, she turned to face him properly. "Thank you, Mr. Logan, but you really shouldn't bother yourself with me again. Newton has a long memory, and they don't take kindly to outsiders who disrupt their established ways." Gabriel studied her for a moment, his green eyes intent. "Miss Morrison, may I speak plainly?" She nodded, bracing herself for whatever condescending advice he might offer. "I've been riding the trails for 15 years now," he said. "Seen towns from Texas to Montana, and one thing I've learned is that cruelty is often just fear dressed up as righteousness." He gestured back toward the main street. "Those folks back there, they're afraid." "Afraid?" Lillian couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. "Of me?" "Of anything different. Anything that reminds them that the world is wider than their narrow view of it." Gabriel replaced his hat, adjusting it against the late afternoon sun. "The way I see it, you shouldn't be the one hanging your head when you walk down that street. What should I do then?" "Shout back, throw rocks of my own." Gabriel shook his head. "Walk with pride, Miss Morrison. You've nothing to be ashamed of." A lump formed in Lillian's throat at the unexpected kindness. Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. Sheriff Tate Blackburn was riding toward them, his face set in its usual scowl of disapproval when it was directed at Lillian. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Gabriel called out, his demeanor shifting to casual politeness. The sheriff reined in his horse. "You must be one of the new hands with Mackenzie," he said, eyeing Gabriel. "I suggest you find different company in town, Cowboy. Some associations aren't worth the trouble they bring." Lillian lowered her eyes, the familiar shame washing over her despite Gabriel's words just moments before. "Is that so?" Gabriel's tone remained pleasant, but something in it caused Lillian to look up. "Strange advice from a lawman. Where I come from, sheriffs protect all citizens, not just the ones they approve of." Sheriff Blackburn's face darkened. "You'd best watch your tone, stranger. Newton is a peaceful town, and I aim to keep it that way." "Peaceful for whom?" Gabriel asked mildly. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster, not drawing but making the gesture clear. "I won't tell you again. Move along from here and find more suitable company." Gabriel didn't move. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm quite satisfied with the company I've chosen." The tension stretched between them until Sheriff Blackburn finally snorted in disgust. "Your funeral, Cowboy." He looked at Lillian. "As for you, Morrison, Widow Peterson complained that your chickens were in her yard again. Keep them penned or I'll have to fine you." "Yes, Sheriff," Lillian murmured. "I'll fix the coop tonight." With a final glare at Gabriel, the sheriff rode off, dust rising in his wake. "You shouldn't have done that," Lillian said once he was out of earshot. "The sheriff can make life difficult for you and your outfit." Gabriel shrugged. "Not the first lawman I've crossed, and likely won't be the last." His expression softened as he looked at her. "Your chickens really escape often." The abrupt change of subject surprised a genuine laugh from her. "No, I don't even have chickens. Widow Peterson just likes to complain about something, and I'm her favorite target." Gabriel shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Well, Miss Morrison, it seems you've been dealt an unfair hand in this town." He looked at her small house with its profusion of flowers. "But you've made something beautiful all the same." Lillian felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with simple kindness, without the undercurrent of disgust or pity that colored most interactions in Newton. "Will you be in town long?" she asked before she could stop herself. "A week, maybe 2. Long enough to rest the herd before pushing on to the railhead at Abilene." He studied her face for a moment. "Long enough, I hope, to perhaps call on you properly, if you'd permit it." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. "Why would you want to do that?" Gabriel's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Because in all my travels, Miss Morrison, I've rarely met someone who could grow beauty in such barren soil." He gestured to her wildflowers. "And I'd like to know the woman capable of such a feat." With that, he tipped his hat and turned to go. "Good day, Miss Morrison. I hope to see you again soon." Lillian watched him walk away, his tall figure straight and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and not a care for what anyone might think of him. It wasn't until he disappeared around the corner that she realized she was still standing at her gate, flower clutched to her chest, a small smile on her face for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Walk with pride," she whispered to herself, testing the feel of the words. Then, squaring her shoulders, she pushed open her gate and walked to her front door with a step that was, perhaps, a little lighter than before. Inside her small house, Lillian set the flower on her kitchen table and sank into the chair her father had made before consumption took him 5 years ago. The house still bore traces of her mother's handmade curtains, her father's careful woodwork, but in the years since their passing, she'd slowly made it her own. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes she'd collected over the years, each one a doorway to someplace far from Newton. She thought about Gabriel Logan's green eyes, and the way he'd stood between her and Hank's taunts without hesitation. She thought about his words, "walk with pride," and wondered what it might be like to move through the world without constantly trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less of a burden on the narrow boardwalks of Newton's consciousness. A dangerous thought, that. Hope was the most perilous thing Lillian could allow herself to feel. It had a way of sharpening the inevitable disappointment. Still, as she prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, she couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to be truly seen not as the town's shame, but as a woman worthy of respect. Worthy, perhaps, of love. Gabriel returned to the cattle camp just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the herd and the men who tended them. The cattle were restless after a day of grazing on unfamiliar land, and the cowboys moved among them with practiced ease, their low voices and occasional whistle keeping the animals settled. "Logan." The call came from near the chuck wagon, where Foreman Marcus Dolly was sharing a smoke with a few of the other men. "Thought you were just going to town for supplies." "You get lost." Gabriel dismounted, patting his horse's neck before leading him to the picket line. "Got sidetracked," he said, securing the reins. "Town's more interesting than it looks from the outside." This brought chuckles from the men. Newton wasn't known for much beyond its saloons and the occasional brawl between rival outfits. "If by interesting you mean has women," Then sure, drawled Pete Campbell, a lanky Texan who'd been riding with Mackenzie's outfit for 3 seasons. Though from what I saw riding through, pickings are slim. Gabriel didn't respond, just began unsaddling his horse, methodically removing the blanket and checking for any sore spots along the animal's back. "You hear about that big gal in town?" another rider asked. "Saw her earlier today. Never seen a woman that size outside a circus show." Gabriel's hand stilled on the saddle. "Her name," he said without turning, "is Miss Morrison." The sudden quiet behind him told Gabriel his tone had carried more edge than he'd intended. He finished with his horse, hung the saddle on the rail, and only then turned to face the men. Most had returned to their own business, but Pete was still watching him, a speculative look in his eyes. "You meet her then?" Pete asked. "I did." Gabriel pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his belt. "Seems like a decent sort. Town treats her poorly." Pete shrugged. "Towns have their ways. Not our business to interfere." "Wasn't planning on interfering," Gabriel said easily, though something in his chest tightened at the memory of the rocks thrown at Lillian's back. "Just stating a fact." Marcus Dolly stepped forward, his weathered face serious beneath his graying mustache. "Logan, you've been with us for what, 3 drives now?" "4," Gabriel corrected. "4 then. And you've been solid, no trouble, good with the cattle, keep to yourself mostly." Marcus scratched his beard. "So take some advice from an old hand. Towns like Newton, they're just way stations. We're here to rest the herd, resupply, maybe enjoy a drink and some female company if that's your inclination. But we're not here to make waves. You understand?" Gabriel met the foreman's gaze steadily. "I understand the job, Marcus. Get the herd to Abilene in good condition. No delays, no troubles." "Good." Marcus nodded. "Then we're clear. Whatever caught your interest in town, don't let it interfere with why we're here." Gabriel nodded back but made no promises. As he headed for the chuck wagon to get his supper, he found himself thinking again of Lillian Morrison, of her quiet dignity in the face of cruelty, of the vibrant flowers that surrounded her modest home, of the brief, genuine laugh he'd drawn from her. There was a story there, beneath the surface of what Newton chose to see, and Gabriel had always been curious about the stories people carried with them. The next few days brought a routine to Newton that both the town and the cattle outfit settled into. The herd grazed on nearby pastures leased from local farmers, gaining strength for the final push to Abilene. The cowboys came to town in shifts, spending their meager pay on whiskey and cards, occasionally causing enough ruckus that Sheriff Blackburn would ride out to the camp to issue warnings about maintaining order. Gabriel found reasons to go into town nearly every day. Supplies needed replenishing, equipment required repair, messages needed sending. And each day, he found his way to Cedar Street, to the small house with the blue door and the riot of wildflowers. Lillian, for her part, was wary at first. When Gabriel appeared on her doorstep the day after their first meeting, a small package of coffee beans in hand, a proper thank you for showing me the way yesterday, she almost didn't invite him in. But something in his easy manner, the way he treated her no differently than he might any other woman, wore down her defenses. They talked on her small porch, Gabriel sitting on the steps while Lillian took the chair her father had built for her mother years ago. He told her about the trail drive, about the storms they'd weathered coming up from Texas, about the night they'd nearly lost a third of the herd when a lightning strike spooked the cattle into a stampede. "We rode through the night," he said, his eyes distant with memory. "Rain coming down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, mud everywhere, cattle bawling and running blind. Lost 2 good men that night." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. Gabriel shrugged. "It's the life. You know the risks when you sign on." He looked up at her. "What about you? Have you always lived in Newton? Lillian nodded. Born and raised. My father was a carpenter, built half the storefronts on Main Street, including the general store. A shadow passed over her face. Things were different when he was alive. People still talked, still stared, but they were more careful about it. He had a temper when it came to how folks treated me and my mother. Your mother was also. Gabriel trailed off, searching for a tactful way to phrase the question. Large, Lillian supplied with a wry smile. Yes. It runs in her family. My grandmother was the same, built for hard winters, my father used to say. Her smile faded. After they both passed, consumption took them both within a year of each other. Well, the town's memory of my father's fists faded pretty quick. Gabriel frowned. And you stayed. Why not leave? Start fresh somewhere people don't know you. Lillian's laugh held no humor. With what money, Mr. Logan? On what horse? To go where? She gestured to the small house behind her. This is all I have. The house is paid for at least. I grow enough in my garden to feed myself, do mending and washing for a few families that don't mind hiring me as long as I come after dark and use the back door. She looked down at her hands, broad and strong like her father's. Besides, who's to say the next town would be any different? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. You could be right, he finally said, but you could be wrong too. World's a big place, Miss Morrison. Lillian, she said suddenly, if you're going to keep calling on me like this, you might as well use my given name. A slow smile spread across Gabriel's face. Lillian it is then, and I'm Gabriel to my friends. Are we friends, Mr. Logan? There was a challenge in her voice, but vulnerability too. I'd like to be, he said simply, if you'll have me. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Gabriel would come by in the afternoon, sometimes with small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a packet of seeds for her garden, once a book of poetry he'd carried in his saddlebag for years. They would talk on her porch, and occasionally, if the weather was fine, walk together in her small garden while she pointed out the different flowers and plants she cultivated. The town noticed, of course. Newton was too small for anything to go unobserved, especially something as unusual as a handsome cowboy calling regularly on the town's most ridiculed resident. The whispers followed them when they were seen together, and more than once, Hank Pritchard or his friends made crude remarks just loud enough to be heard as Gabriel and Lillian passed. Gabriel ignored them with an ease born of long practice, but he noticed how Lillian would tense, her steps faltering, her eyes dropping to the ground. Why do you let them affect you so? He asked one evening as they walked back from the general store, where Lillian had needed to purchase thread. The shopkeeper had made them wait until all other customers were served before grudgingly taking Lillian's money. Lillian sighed. It's not that simple, Gabriel. You'll be gone in another week. I have to live here. You don't, though, he pointed out. That's what I'm trying to tell you. You could leave. And go where? The familiar frustration edged her voice. Do what? I have no family, no money saved beyond what keeps me fed from month to month. The world isn't kind to women alone, Gabriel, especially not women who look like me. Gabriel stopped walking, causing Lillian to pause and turn back to him. The evening sun caught in her hair, bringing out auburn highlights in the brown waves she typically kept pinned severely back from her face. Come to Abilene, he said suddenly. Lillian blinked. What? Come to Abilene with the drive, Gabriel repeated, the idea taking shape as he spoke. It's a bigger town, more opportunities. You could start fresh there. Gabriel, I can't just— You can, he insisted, stepping closer. Lillian, I've watched you these past days. The way you lower your eyes when anyone looks at you, the way you try to make yourself smaller, invisible. It's like you're disappearing a little more each day, and it's killing me to see it. Lillian stared at him, her brown eyes wide with surprise at his vehemence. "You deserve better," Gabriel continued more softly. "You deserve to walk down a street without rocks being thrown at your back. You deserve to be treated with basic human decency. And you think Abilene will be different," doubt colored her words. "I think anywhere would be different from here," Gabriel said honestly. "And yes, Abilene is bigger, busier. People have their own concerns. They don't have time to fixate on who's different." Lillian looked away, her expression troubled. "Even if I wanted to, and I'm not saying I do, how would I even get there? I don't have a wagon or a horse. We have spare mounts," Gabriel said. "And the chuck wagon could carry whatever belongings you need to bring. Marcus Dolly would never allow it. Let me worry about Marcus." Gabriel reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. Her fingers were work-roughened but warm in his. "Just think about it. Please." Lillian looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, searching for something mockery, perhaps, or deceit. Finding neither, she slowly nodded. "I'll think about it," she promised. "But Gabriel, I need you to understand something. I've lived with disappointment all my life. I've learned not to hope for too much." She squeezed his hand once, then released it. "Don't make promises you can't keep. I couldn't bear it." The seriousness in her voice struck Gabriel to the core. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I won't." As they resumed walking toward Cedar Street, Gabriel wondered if he was making a mistake. His life on the trail didn't lend itself to permanence or promises. He'd avoided entanglements for years, preferring the freedom of the open range and the simplicity of moving from job to job, town to town. But something about Lillian Morrison, her quiet strength, her capacity for beauty despite the harshness of her life, had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just pity or a sense of injustice, though both were present. It was something more, something that made him want to see her smile more often, to hear her laugh without the bitter edge that so often accompanied it. It was something that made him think, for the first time in many years, about what it might be like to stop moving, to find a place and a person worth staying for. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Gabriel was helping check the cattle for signs of disease, a necessary precaution before the final push to Abilene, when Marcus Dolly rode up, his expression grim. "Logan," he called, "need a word." Gabriel handed the calf he'd been examining back to its anxious mother and walked over to where Marcus waited on horseback. "Problem?" he asked. "Could be." Marcus dismounted, leading his horse a few paces away from the other men. "Got word from town this morning. Sheriff Blackburn's been asking questions about you." Gabriel frowned. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me think he's looking for trouble." Marcus scratched his beard, a habit when he was concerned. "Wanted to know your full name, where you're from, if you've ridden with us long. Asked if you had any unusual interests." "Unusual interests," Gabriel repeated flatly. "He mean Lillian Morrison." "Didn't say it outright, but yeah, that's the sense I got." Marcus gave him a hard look. "Logan, I told you to steer clear of complications. Whatever's going on with you and that woman, her name is Lillian," Gabriel interrupted, a rare edge to his voice. Marcus held up his hands. "Fine. Lillian. Whatever's happening there, it's stirring up the town, and that's bad for business. We need Newton's goodwill to rest this herd properly before Abilene. So you want me to stay away from her? I'm saying be discreet at least." Marcus sighed. "Look, I don't care what you do on your own time, but this outfit can't afford trouble with local law. Blackburn strikes me as the type to make things difficult if he takes a dislike to someone." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. "I'll handle Blackburn," he finally said, "but I won't stop seeing Lillian." Marcus studied him, then gave a short nod. "Have it your way. Just keep the outfit out of it." He turned to remount his horse, then paused. One more thing. Pete mentioned you've been talking to the woman about Abilene. That true? Gabriel tensed. Might be. You thinking of bringing her along with the drive? When Gabriel didn't immediately deny it, Marcus shook his head. Jesus, Logan. No. Absolutely not. Cattle drive's no place for a woman, especially one with no experience on the trail. She wouldn't be on the drive itself, Gabriel argued. She could travel with the chuck wagon, stay back from the herd. And what happens when we get to Abilene? You planning to set her up there? With what? Marcus's voice was incredulous. Or is this some half-baked notion of gallantry that ends with you riding off and her stranded in a strange town? The words hit too close to Lillian's own concerns, and Gabriel felt a flash of anger. I know what I'm doing. No, you don't. Marcus's tone softened slightly. Look, I get it. Pretty woman, sad story, you want to play hero. But this isn't some dime novel, Logan. Real life doesn't work that way. She's not some charity case, Gabriel said firmly. She's a woman who deserves better than what this town gives her. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You're sweet on her, he finally said. It wasn't a question. Gabriel didn't deny it. Will you help or not? The foreman sighed heavily. I can't stop you from making a fool of yourself, but I'm not risking this outfit's reputation or our contract by bringing along a woman the local sheriff has taken issue with. His expression hardened. That's final, Logan. Find another way if you're determined to help her. With that, Marcus mounted up and rode back toward the main herd, leaving Gabriel standing alone with his thoughts and a growing sense that time was running short. Lillian spent the day after Gabriel's proposal in a state of anxious contemplation. Leave Newton. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. She moved through her small house, touching the familiar objects: her mother's china teacup, her father's whittling knife, the quilt her grandmother had made for her 16th birthday. Each item held memories, anchored her to this place that had never truly accepted her. Could she leave it all behind? Start fresh in Abilene, where no one knew her history, where she might walk down the street without whispers following her like shadows. And then there was Gabriel himself. In just over a week, he'd shown her more kindness than she'd experienced in years. When he looked at her, she didn't see disgust or pity. She saw appreciation, interest, even admiration. It made her feel both seen and unseen, seen for who she truly was, rather than just her size, but unseen in the way her physical form seemed to matter less to him than her mind, her conversation, her laugh. It was intoxicating. And dangerous. Lillian wasn't naive. Cowboys were notorious for their wandering ways. Gabriel might have the best intentions now, but what about in a month? A year? Would he grow tired of her, leave her alone in a strange city? Or worse, would his interest fade once the novelty wore off, once she was no longer the poor, mistreated woman he'd rescued from Newton's cruelty? A knock at her door interrupted these thoughts. Expecting Gabriel, Lillian smoothed her dress and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear before opening the door. Instead of Gabriel's warm smile, she found Sheriff Blackburn's stern face. "Sheriff," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Is something wrong?" "That depends, Miss Morrison." Blackburn didn't wait for an invitation, pushing past her into the small front room. "I understand you've been keeping company with one of Mackenzie's cowboys." Lillian closed the door slowly, her heart beginning to pound. "I don't see how that's any concern of yours, Sheriff." Blackburn turned to face her, his hand resting casually on his holster, a habit that always made her uneasy. "It becomes my concern when it disrupts the peace of this town." "I wasn't aware that two people talking on a porch constituted a disruption," Lillian said, surprising herself with her boldness. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You've developed quite a mouth since that drifter started calling on you. Not sure it suits you." Lillian said nothing, but she didn't lower her gaze as she might have before. "Here's what I know," Blackburn continued. "Gabriel Logan has been asking around town about property in Abilene, about stage routes there too." He took a step closer. "He planning on taking you with him when the drive moves on?" The direct question caught Lillian off guard. That's not, because I'd advise against it, Miss Morrison." Blackburn's voice took on a false concern. "Men like Logan, they move from town to town, woman to woman. Whatever he's promised you, I guarantee he won't keep it." Anger flared in Lillian's chest. "You don't know him." "I know his kind." Blackburn glanced around the small room, his gaze dismissive. "What I don't understand is what he sees in you, unless—" The implication hung in the air, and Lillian felt her face flame with humiliation and rage. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking. "Get out of my house." Blackburn raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Miss Morrison. I'm still the law in Newton." "And this is still my property," Lillian countered, finding strength in her anger. "Unless you have official business, I'm asking you to leave. Now." For a tense moment, Blackburn didn't move. Then he adjusted his hat and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "Consider this friendly advice, Miss Morrison. Stay where you belong. Newton may not always be kind to you, but at least you know where you stand. Out there." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "You'll be even more of an oddity than you are here." The door closed behind him with a finality that sent a chill through Lillian despite the warm spring air. She sank into her father's chair, trembling slightly, torn between anger at Blackburn's intrusion and fear that his words held a kernel of truth. What if Gabriel was just passing time with her? What if his interest was merely curiosity or worse, pity? The thought was almost too painful to contemplate, yet even as doubt gnawed at her, another part of her rebelled. In the short time she'd known him, Gabriel had shown himself to be thoughtful, honest, and direct. He didn't speak in riddles or offer empty flattery. When he looked at her with those clear green eyes, she believed him. The real question wasn't whether she trusted Gabriel, it was whether she trusted herself enough to take the chance he was offering. When Gabriel arrived later that afternoon, Lillian was waiting on the porch, her face set with determination. "We need to talk," she said before he could even offer a greeting. Gabriel climbed the steps slowly, sensing the shift in her mood. "I'm listening." "Sheriff Blackburn came to see me today." She watched his face carefully as she spoke. "He seems to think you're planning to take me to Abilene." Gabriel's expression darkened. "Blackburn needs to mind his own business." "Is it true? Have you been asking about property there, about stage routes?" Gabriel sighed and sat on the porch railing. "Yes, I wanted to know what options might be available if you decided to come." "Why?" The question burst from her with more force than she'd intended. "Why go to such trouble for someone you barely know?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant horizon where the prairie stretched endlessly toward the setting sun. "My mother," he finally said, "was Cherokee. Half anyway. My father was Irish, came west during the gold rush, stayed to ranch." He turned to look at Lillian. "Growing up in Texas after the war, being mixed wasn't easy. Not for her, not for me." Lillian hadn't expected this. Nothing in Gabriel's appearance had suggested native heritage to her untrained eye. His skin was tanned from the sun, but not notably darker than any other cowboy's. His features strong but not distinctly different from the men who passed through Newton regularly. "People can be cruel about what they don't understand," Gabriel continued. "About what's different. I watched my mother endure it, the whispers, the refusal of service in stores, the way women would pull their children closer when she walked by." His jaw tightened at the memory. "She never let it break her. Walk with pride, she'd tell me. Never let them see they've wounded you." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Lillian said softly. "She was." A small smile touched his lips. She died when I was 16. Fever took her in 3 days. After that, I couldn't stay on the ranch. Too many memories. So I started riding with cattle outfits, moving from place to place. He met her eyes directly. I know what it's like to be judged for something you can't change, Lillian. To be seen as less because you don't fit what others think you should be. Understanding dawned on Lillian's face. So when you saw those boys throwing rocks, I saw myself, Gabriel admitted. Or rather, I saw the person I wish I'd been back then, someone who stood up, who didn't just ride past when they saw injustice. He shrugged. But it's more than that now. This past week, getting to know you, your kindness, your strength, the way you can laugh despite everything. He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed by his own earnestness. Lillian found herself speechless. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such open admiration, such genuine respect. I'm not asking you to come to Abilene for my sake, Gabriel continued when she didn't speak. I'm asking because I think you deserve the chance to find out who you might be in a place that doesn't know you only as the woman to mock or shun. And if I come, Lillian asked, her voice barely above a whisper, what happens then? Between us, I mean. Gabriel stood and moved to stand before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. I don't know, he said honestly. I've never felt this way before, Lillian. I can't promise you forever. My life doesn't allow for that kind of certainty. But I can promise you this. As long as you want me by your side, I'll be there. And if the day comes when you don't, I'll respect that too. Lillian searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, any hint that this was some elaborate joke at her expense. She found none. There's a problem, she said after a moment. Marcus Dolly won't allow me to travel with the drive, will he? Gabriel's slight wince confirmed her suspicion. No, but there are other ways to get to Abilene. The stage runs twice a week. I can't afford the stage fare. I can, Gabriel said simply. Lillian frowned. I won't be a charity case, Gabriel. It's not charity, he insisted. It's... He paused, searching for the right words. It's an investment in possibility, in what might be. The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. Lillian turned away, blinking back sudden tears. I need time to think, she said. This isn't a small decision. Of course. Gabriel took a step back, giving her space. The drive leaves in 4 days. The stage runs the day after tomorrow and again next week. He hesitated, then added, whatever you decide, Lillian, know that meeting you has changed something in me. I'm grateful for that, no matter what happens next. He left her then, walking back toward town with long, measured strides, his hat pulled low against the setting sun. Lillian watched him go, her heart torn between the safety of the familiar and the terrifying promise of the unknown. That night, Lillian barely slept. She paced her small house, weighing the risks against the possibilities, trying to imagine a life beyond Newton. Dawn found her at her kitchen table, a cup of cold tea forgotten beside her, her decision made. She would go. Not because Gabriel had asked, not even because Newton had become unbearable, but because for the first time in years, she wanted something more than mere survival. She wanted the chance to discover who Lillian Morrison might be when freed from the weight of lifelong judgment. The morning stage would leave at 10 o'clock. She had just enough time to pack her essentials and close up the house. It wouldn't sell quickly, if at all, but perhaps someday she might return for the treasured mementos she couldn't take with her now. As Lillian moved through her familiar rooms, selecting what to bring and what to leave, a strange calm settled over her. This was right, she realized. Terrifying, yes, but right. A loud knocking at her door startled her from these thoughts. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, too early for casual visitors. Her first thought was Gabriel, but the insistent pounding lacked his usual restraint. When she opened the door, she found not Gabriel but Hank Pritchard and two of his friends, their faces flushed with what looked like a night of drinking not yet ended. "Well, look who's up early," Hank slurred. "Getting ready to run off with your cowboy, are you?" Lillian tried to close the door, but Hank shoved his boot into the gap. "That's rude," he said, his tone hardening. "Especially after we came all this way to say goodbye." "Please leave," Lillian said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's too early for visitors. Hear that, boys?" Too early for us, but I bet she wouldn't say that to her cowboy. Hank leaned closer, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath making Lillian recoil. "What's he see in you anyway? Must be desperate out on that trail." "Or blind," one of his friends added with a snicker. "Leave now," Lillian said more firmly, "or I'll call for help." Hank laughed. "Who's gonna help you? The whole town knows what you are, an embarrassment, a freak." His face twisted with sudden anger. "You think you can just leave, after being a burden on this town for years? After my pa had to widen the boardwalk outside his store just so you wouldn't break it?" The old hurt lanced through Lillian, but she fought to maintain her composure. "Your father widened that boardwalk because it was rotting through, Hank Pritchard, and you know it. Now get your foot out of my door before you what?" Hank pushed harder, forcing the door open wider. "What are you gonna do, sit on me?" The crude joke sent his friends into fresh laughter, but Lillian had had enough. Years of enduring such taunts, of swallowing her anger and hurt, of making herself small to avoid notice, all of it crystallized in that moment into a white-hot fury. With a strength born of that anger, she shoved the door hard against Hank's foot, causing him to yelp in pain and stumble backward. Taking advantage of his surprise, Lillian stepped onto her porch, drawing herself up to her full height. "Get off my property," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "All of you, now." Something in her demeanor, perhaps the unfamiliar sight of Lillian Morrison standing tall and unafraid, gave the young men pause. They exchanged glances, their bravado wavering. "You think that cowboy really wants you?" Hank sneered, recovering some of his courage. "He's just using you, you know. Probably made a bet with his friends about betting the fat girl in town." The words were meant to wound, to drive her back into shame and silence. A week ago, they might have succeeded. But now Lillian thought of Gabriel's eyes when he looked at her, of his words, "walk with pride," and found that Hank's cruelty couldn't touch the core of certainty that had formed within her. "Leave," she repeated, taking a step toward them. "Or I promise you'll regret it." It wasn't her words, but her unwavering gaze that finally made them retreat, muttering curses as they stumbled down her garden path. Lillian watched them go, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. When they reached the gate, Hank turned back. "This isn't over," he called. "You and that cowboy think you can make fools of this town. Just wait." Once they were out of sight, Lillian returned inside, bolting the door behind her. Her hands trembled slightly as reaction set in, but beneath the fear was something new, a fierce pride in having stood her ground, in having found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She returned to her packing with renewed determination. Newton had nothing left to offer her but more of the same cruelty she'd endured all her life. Whatever awaited in Abilene with or without Gabriel had to be better than this. By 9 o'clock, Lillian had packed a single trunk with her most practical belongings: clothes, a few books, her mother's wedding ring, her father's whittling knife. She'd written a letter to Widow Jenkins next door, asking her to keep an eye on the house and giving her permission to use the garden as her own, until Lillian returned or sent word about selling the property. All that remained was to get herself and her trunk to the stage depot on Main Street. Normally, she avoided Main Street at busy times, preferring to run her errands early in the morning or near closing time when fewer people would see her. But today, she had no choice. The stage waited for no one. Lillian stood at her mirror, pinning her hair neatly beneath her best bonnet. The woman who looked back at her seemed different, somehow still full-figured, still Lillian Morrison, but with a light in her eyes that had been absent for too long. "Walk with pride," she whispered to her reflection. A knock at the door made her heart leap. Gabriel at last. But when she opened it, she found not Gabriel but Marcus Dolly, his weathered face solemn beneath his hat. "Miss Morrison," he said, removing his hat. "May I have a word?" Confused and wary after her earlier encounter with Hank, Lillian hesitated before nodding and stepping aside to let him enter. "If you're looking for Gabriel, he's not here," she said. "I know. That's partly why I've come." Marcus stood awkwardly in her small front room, his hat in his hands. "I understand you're planning to take the morning stage to Abilene." Lillian's wariness increased. "How did you know that?" "Newton's a small town. Word travels," he sighed. "Miss Morrison, I'm not here to interfere with your plans, but there's something you should know before you go." "What is it? Is Gabriel all right?" Marcus nodded. "He's fine. Or he was when I left camp an hour ago, but there's trouble brewing." He glanced out the window, checking the street. "Sheriff Blackburn and some of the town men rode out to our camp at dawn. They're claiming Gabriel stole money from the bank yesterday." "That's ridiculous," Lillian exclaimed. "Gabriel wouldn't steal anything." "You and I might know that, but Blackburn's determined to make a case of it. Claims a witness saw Gabriel near the bank after hours, and this morning they discovered money missing." Marcus's expression was grave. "I think it's a setup. Gabriel's been too vocal about his opinions regarding how this town treats certain people, made enemies." Lillian felt cold despite the warm spring morning. "What's happening now? Where's Gabriel? That's the problem." When Blackburn arrived with his posse, Gabriel wasn't at camp. He'd ridden out early, said he had business in town. Marcus looked directly at Lillian. "I think he was coming to see you to escort you to the stage. But he never made it here, did he?" Lillian shook her head, fear growing in her chest. "You think Blackburn intercepted him? It's possible. Or maybe Gabriel heard about the accusations and is lying low until he can clear his name." Marcus put his hat back on. "Either way, Miss Morrison, it might be best if you delayed your travel plans, at least until we know what's happened." Lillian moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Newton seemed peaceful in the morning light, but she knew now how deceptive that peace was, how hatred could simmer beneath the surface of small-town civility, erupting when least expected. "No," she said finally, turning back to Marcus. "I won't delay. If Gabriel is in trouble, it's partly because of me, because he stood up for me, because he dared to treat me as a person worthy of respect." Her voice strengthened with each word. "I won't hide in this house while he faces that alone." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You care for him?" It wasn't a question, but Lillian answered anyway. "Yes, more than I thought possible in such a short time." "He feels the same," Marcus said simply. "Never seen him like this about anyone. It's why I came to warn you." He moved toward the door. "Be careful, Miss Morrison. Blackburn's not a man to cross lightly." After Marcus left, Lillian stood for a long moment in the center of her small front room, weighing her options. The safest choice would be to stay home, to wait for news of Gabriel, to let events unfold without her involvement. It was what she'd always done, kept her head down, avoided confrontation, made herself as invisible as possible in a town that despised her very existence. But she was tired of being invisible, tired of being safe while sacrificing everything that might make life worth living. With sudden determination, Lillian removed her bonnet and changed from her traveling dress into a simpler one that allowed for easier movement. If Gabriel was in trouble, she needed to find him. And the first place to look was the sheriff's office. The walk to Main Street felt different this time. Lillian didn't hunch her shoulders or keep her eyes on the ground. She walked with purpose, her head high, ignoring the startled looks of the few early risers she passed. Newton could stare all it wanted. She was done hiding. The sheriff's office was a small wooden building next to the jailhouse, its windows dark despite the morning hour. Lillian hesitated on the boardwalk opposite, watching for any sign of movement inside. The street was relatively quiet, most businesses not yet open for the day. The stage depot down the block showed signs of activity as the 10 o'clock departure approached. As Lillian stood considering her next move, the door to the sheriff's office opened, and Deputy Collins stepped out, adjusting his gun belt. Lillian ducked into the narrow alley between the dry goods store and the barber shop, watching as Collins looked up and down the street before heading toward the saloon. Once he was out of sight, Lillian crossed the street quickly, her heart pounding. The sheriff's office door was unlocked. Newton rarely had enough crime to warrant serious security measures. Inside, the office was empty, but the door to the cells in the back stood partially open. Lillian moved quietly across the room, years of trying to pass unnoticed making her footsteps light despite her size. At the cell door, she paused, listening. A low groan from within spurred her forward. Gabriel sat on the floor of the single-occupied cell, his back against the wall, a livid bruise darkening one side of his face. His hat lay beside him, and blood had dried in a thin line from a cut above his eyebrow. "Gabriel," Lillian gasped, rushing to the bars. His head came up at her voice, eyes widening in surprise. "Lillian, what are you doing here?" He struggled to his feet, wincing. "You need to go now. Blackburn could be back any minute." "What happened?" "Marcus told me about the theft accusation, but," she gestured to his injuries. "Blackburn and his men were waiting for me on the road to town," Gabriel said grimly. "Said they had witness claiming I broke into the bank last night. When I told them it was a lie, they decided to be persuasive." His attempt at a smile turned into a grimace of pain. Lillian's hands tightened on the bars. "This is my fault." "No," Gabriel said firmly. "This is about small men with too much power and too little decency." He moved closer to the bars, lowering his voice. "Lillian, listen to me. The stage leaves in less than an hour. You need to be on it." "I'm not leaving you here like this." "You have to," Gabriel insisted. "Once Blackburn realizes his plan to frame me isn't keeping you in Newton, he'll find another way. You need to go while you still can." Lillian shook her head. "No, not without you." The sound of voices outside made them both freeze. Gabriel backed away from the bars. "Go," he urged, "out the back door." Now, instead, Lillian moved to the sheriff's desk, frantically searching the drawers. In the bottom one, she found what she was looking for, a ring of keys. She grabbed them just as the front door began to open. Without time to test which key might fit Gabriel's cell, Lillian darted back through the door to the cells, closing it behind her. "Hide these," she whispered, sliding the keys through the bars to Gabriel, who quickly tucked them into his boot. She had just stepped away from the cell when Sheriff Blackburn entered, followed by Deputy Collins. "Well, well," Blackburn drawled, his hand dropping to his holster. "Miss Morrison, this is a surprise." Lillian squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Sheriff, I came to see about Gabriel's release. There's been a mistake." "No mistake," Blackburn said coldly. "Your friend here was caught red-handed with money stolen from the bank. He'll hang for it." "That's a lie," Gabriel called from his cell. "And you know it, Blackburn." The sheriff ignored him, his focus on Lillian. "You're missing your stage, Miss Morrison, though I suppose now you have reason to stay in Newton after all." The implication was clear. Gabriel's arrest was meant to keep Lillian from leaving, to maintain the status quo in Newton, where she remained the town's perpetual outcast. A reminder to all of what happened when you didn't conform. "I'm taking that stage, Sheriff," Lillian said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "And Gabriel will be joining me." Blackburn laughed. "Is that so? And how exactly do you figure that will happen?" "Because," Lillian said, drawing herself up to her full height and looking down at the sheriff from her considerable advantage, "you have no evidence against him. No witnesses who'll stand up in front of a judge. No stolen money to produce." She took a step forward, and Blackburn perhaps unconsciously took one back. "What you do have is a jail cell full of a man who's done nothing wrong except treat me with basic human decency. A man who's part of an outfit that brings business to Newton regularly. A man whose boss, I imagine, wouldn't take kindly to having one of his hands falsely imprisoned." She paused, watching Blackburn's face as her words sank in. "How do you think Mackenzie will react when he hears one of his men was beaten and jailed on trumped-up charges? Do you think he'll continue to do business in Newton? Do you think any of the cattle outfits will, once word spreads?" Blackburn's expression darkened. "Are you threatening me, Miss Morrison?" "I'm stating facts, Sheriff." Lillian glanced at Deputy Collins, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Newton needs the cattle business. Mayor Thompson knows it. The merchants know it. I wonder what they'd say if they knew you were risking it all just to keep me in my place." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Blackburn moved to the cell door, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You're making a mistake," he said to Gabriel. "Both of you. This town has a long memory." "So do I," Gabriel replied evenly. "And I'll be sure to share those memories widely in Abilene and beyond." With a curse, Blackburn unlocked the cell. "Get out, both of you, and don't come back to Newton if you know what's good for you." Gabriel stepped out of the cell, moving to Lillian's side. His hand found hers, squeezing it gently. "Wouldn't dream of it, Sheriff," he said. "Town like this doesn't deserve good people like Lillian anyway." Together they walked out of the sheriff's office and into the bright morning sunshine. Once they were a safe distance away, Gabriel turned to Lillian, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "That," he said softly, "was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Lillian felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I was terrified the whole time." "Courage isn't about not being afraid," Gabriel said. "It's about doing what's right despite the fear." He touched her cheek gently. "You were magnificent." The warmth of his gaze made her heart flutter. "We need to hurry," she said. "The stage leaves soon, and I still need to get my trunk from home." Gabriel nodded. "Let's go, then. Abilene awaits." They made it to the stage depot with minutes to spare. Gabriel paid for their tickets while Lillian's trunk was loaded onto the roof of the coach. As they prepared to board, a commotion at the end of the street drew their attention. Hank Pritchard and his friends were approaching, their faces set with purpose. Behind them, Sheriff Blackburn stood in the doorway of his office, watching. "Looks like our departure won't be without an audience," Gabriel murmured. Lillian took a deep breath. "Let them watch." As Hank's group drew nearer, Gabriel stepped slightly in front of Lillian, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. He'd been relieved of his gun when arrested. "You really leaving with him?" Hank called to Lillian, his voice carrying across the street. "Turning your back on the town that raised you?" Lillian stepped forward, placing a hand on Gabriel's arm to stay him. "The town that raised me died with my parents, Hank Pritchard," she said clearly. "What's left is just a shadow of what Newton could be, small and mean and afraid of anything different." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Lillian spotted Widow Jenkins, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "You'll be back," Hank sneered. Where else would take someone like you? Gabriel tensed beside her, but Lillian squeezed his arm. This was her fight, her moment of reckoning with the town that had shaped her through its cruelty. I don't know what awaits me in Abilene or beyond, she said, her voice steady and clear. But I know this. I am Lillian Morrison. I am strong. I am capable. I am worthy of respect and kindness and love. She looked around at the gathered faces, some hostile, some curious, a few even showing a glimmer of shame. And I have spent far too long allowing this town to convince me otherwise. The stagecoach driver called for final boarding. Gabriel offered Lillian his hand. "Ready?" he asked softly. Lillian took one last look at Newton, the dusty streets, the familiar buildings, the faces of people who had known her all her life yet never truly seen her. Then she turned to Gabriel, whose green eyes held nothing but admiration and possibility. "Ready," she said, taking his hand. As Gabriel helped her into the coach, Lillian held her head high. She didn't look back as the stage pulled away, the dust of Newton gradually receding behind them. Instead, she looked forward, toward Gabriel sitting across from her, toward the open horizon beyond the coach window, toward a future filled with uncertainty but also, for the first time in memory, with hope. The journey to Abilene took 2 days, the stagecoach stopping overnight at a way station where travelers could rest on narrow cots in a communal room. Gabriel insisted on paying for a private room for Lillian, while he slept with the other male passengers on the floor of the main room. Despite his efforts to ease her journey, Lillian couldn't help noticing how the other passengers stared when they thought she wasn't looking, how they shifted in their seats as if worried she might take up too much space. Old habits made her want to shrink, to apologize merely for existing. But each time that feeling arose, she would catch Gabriel watching her with those clear green eyes, and she would remember his words, "Walk with pride." By the time they reached Abilene, Lillian had stopped caring about the sidelong glances. Let them look, she thought. I am through with shame. Abilene in 1878 was a bustling cattle town, its streets crowded with cowboys, merchants, and the usual assortment of characters drawn to places where money flowed freely. The noise and energy of it overwhelmed Lillian at first after the relative quiet of Newton. "It's a lot to take in," Gabriel said as they stood outside the stage depot, their belongings at their feet. "But you'll get used to it." Lillian nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "Where do we go now?" Gabriel had clearly given this some thought. "I've arranged lodging for you at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house. It's clean, respectable, and she doesn't ask too many questions." He pointed down the street. "It's 3 blocks that way." "And you?" Lillian asked, suddenly anxious. Now that they had arrived, would Gabriel return to his outfit, his duty done? "I'll be staying at the Drovers Hotel near the stockyards," he said. "The herd should arrive in about 5 days, and I need to be there when it does." Seeing her expression, he added quickly, "It's not far, Lillian, and I'll come see you every day if you'll allow it." Relief flooded through her. "I'd like that." Mrs. Hollister proved to be a thin, sharp-eyed woman of about 50, who looked Lillian up and down with an assessing gaze but made no comment about her size. She showed Lillian to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, with a window overlooking a side street. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, Mrs. Hollister said briskly. "No gentlemen callers in the rooms, but you can receive them in the parlor until 9 o'clock. Church on Sundays is expected." With that, she left Lillian to settle in. The room felt both strange and welcoming, the first space that was truly her own, unburdened by memories or Newton's expectations. Lillian unpacked her few belongings, arranging them carefully to make the room feel more personal. When she was done, she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of pure wonder. She had done it. She had left Newton behind. Gabriel called for her that evening, as promised, and they walked through Abilene together. He showed her the main streets, pointing out shops she might need: the general store, the milliner's, the lending library. People glanced at them. Of course, Lillian's size still drew attention, but there was a different quality to the looks here. Curiosity rather than judgment, or simply the brief acknowledgement of strangers passing in a busy town. "See," Gabriel said as they strolled back toward the boarding house. "Nobody cares here. Too many people, too much happening. Everyone's caught up in their own business." Lillian had to admit he was right. For the first time in her life, she was walking down a street without whispers following in her wake. The freedom of it was intoxicating. "Now," Gabriel said, stopping at the corner near Mrs. Hollister's, "we need to talk about what comes next." Lillian's heart skipped. "Next?" Gabriel nodded. "You need work, a way to support yourself. I've been asking around, and there's a position available at the dressmaker's shop on Main Street. Mrs. Chen needs someone who can sew well." He looked at her hopefully. "You mentioned you make your own clothes. Are you handy with a needle?" Lillian nodded, touched that he had remembered such a detail. "My mother taught me. I used to do mending for some of the families in Newton." "Perfect. I told Mrs. Chen you'd stop by tomorrow morning." He hesitated. "If that's acceptable to you, of course." Lillian smiled. "It's more than acceptable. It's wonderful. Thank you, Gabriel." His answering smile warmed her from the inside out. "There's something else," he said. "I need to go back out with the outfit after we deliver the herd. There's another drive from San Antonio that Mackenzie's contracted for." Lillian's smile faltered. "How long will you be gone?" 6 weeks, maybe 2 months." Gabriel took her hand, his expression earnest. "But I'll come back, Lillian, if you want me to." The question hung between them in the gathering dusk. Lillian looked at their joined hands, his tanned and calloused from years of rope and reins, hers pale and strong from years of hard work in her garden and home. Different, but somehow fitting together perfectly. "I want you to," she said softly. Gabriel's face lit with such joy that Lillian felt her breath catch. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Then I will," he promised. "Every time I'll come back to you." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that Lillian had never experienced before, one of purpose, of gradually unfurling confidence, of cautious joy. Mrs. Chen hired her on the spot when she demonstrated her stitching, and soon Lillian was spending her days in the back room of the dress shop, her skilled hands turning fine fabrics into garments for Abilene's more prosperous citizens. Mrs. Chen, a small, energetic woman who had come from San Francisco after her husband died, seemed to understand something of what it meant to be an outsider. She never commented on Lillian's size except to note, matter-of-factly, that Lillian's height allowed her to manage larger bolts of fabric more easily than Mrs. Chen herself could. "Many shapes of people in this world," Mrs. Chen said simply, when Lillian tentatively raised the subject. "All need clothes. All deserve beauty." And that was that. True to his word, Gabriel came to see Lillian every day after the cattle drive arrived. They walked through Abilene in the evenings, talking of everything and nothing: his years on the trail, her childhood in Newton, books they had read, dreams they had harbored in secret places of their hearts. Slowly, carefully, they built a bridge between their two worlds. And when the time came for Gabriel to leave with the outfit for the next drive, Lillian found she could face his departure with sorrow but not despair. He would come back. She believed that now. The day before he was to leave, Gabriel took Lillian to a small restaurant on the edge of town, run by a French chef who had somehow found his way to Kansas. Over a meal finer than any Lillian had ever eaten, Gabriel reached across the table and took her hand. "I have something for you," he said, placing a small package before her. "A parting gift until I return." Lillian unwrapped it carefully to find a small leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a pattern of wildflowers. "I thought," Gabriel said, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "that you might write to me while I'm gone, about your days, your thoughts. And I'll write to you too." He gestured to an address written inside the cover. "You can send letters there. It's a way station where we'll stop regularly. The owner's an old friend. He'll hold them for me." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes as she ran her fingers over the delicate pattern on the journal's cover. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like you," Gabriel said simply. Lillian looked up, startled. No one had ever called her beautiful before, not her parents, certainly not anyone in Newton. She waited for the familiar doubt to rise, the certainty that he was mocking her or speaking from pity. It didn't come. Instead, looking into Gabriel's steady gaze, she saw only sincerity, only a man who somehow saw in her what she had never been able to see in herself. "Gabriel," she began, but words failed her. He seemed to understand. Rising from his chair, he moved around the table and, in full view of the restaurant's other patrons, bent to kiss her cheek gently. "I'll come back to you, Lillian Morrison," he murmured against her skin. "That's a promise." The next morning, she stood at the edge of town and watched him ride out with the outfit, his figure straight and proud in the saddle. His hat tipped to her in a final salute before he disappeared over the horizon. Lillian touched her cheek where his lips had been, and for the first time in her life, she felt beautiful. The weeks of Gabriel's absence passed more quickly than Lillian had expected. Her work at Mrs. Chen's kept her busy during the days, and in the evenings, she wrote in the journal Gabriel had given her, recording the small details of her new life in Abilene, the gradual unfurling of a woman who was learning, step by step, what it meant to walk with pride. She made friends cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Sarah, a young widow who also boarded at Mrs. Hollister's, Thomas, the elderly librarian who set aside books he thought she might enjoy, Mrs. Chen herself, whose brisk manner concealed a kind heart and wry humor. None of them seemed to care about Lillian's size. Or if they did, it was merely one fact among many about her, no more defining than her brown hair or her skill with a needle. True to his word, Gabriel wrote to her. His letters arrived irregularly, sometimes 3 at once after weeks of silence, carried by travelers or merchants making their way to Abilene. His handwriting was neat but cramped, as if he had learned to make the most of precious paper. He told her of the cattle, of the changing landscapes they passed through, of the stars over the open range at night. And in every letter, between the lines of everyday observation, ran a current of longing that matched her own. "I think of you often," he wrote in one. "Of your laugh, of the way sunlight catches in your hair, of your hands moving so surely with needle and thread. I have known many places, Lillian, but none that calls to me as strongly as the thought of returning to you." Lillian kept his letters beneath her pillow, reading them by candlelight when sleep eluded her. She wrote back faithfully, sending her letters to the way stations he had mentioned, hoping they would reach him, hoping he would understand what she found so difficult to say directly, that he had changed her life, that she was becoming someone new in his absence, someone who might be worthy of the regard he had shown her. 10 weeks after Gabriel's departure, as summer gave way to early autumn, Lillian stood before the mirror in her boarding house room and hardly recognized the woman who looked back at her. She was still full-figured, still tall and broad-shouldered, her body unchanged in its essential nature. But her posture was different, straight rather than hunched, open rather than closed. Her eyes held confidence rather than apology. Her clothes, made by her own hands from fabrics Mrs. Chen had insisted she take as part of her wages, flattered rather than concealed. "Walk with pride," she whispered to her reflection, and smiled at how natural those words felt now. A knock at her door broke her reverie. Probably Sarah, Lillian thought, coming to see if she wanted to walk to the lending library together as they often did on Saturday afternoons. But when she opened the door, it was Mrs. Hollister who stood there, her usual stern expression softened by something that might have been a smile. "You have a caller, Miss Morrison," she said. "In the parlor." Lillian's heart leapt. Gabriel wasn't due back for at least another week, according to his last letter. But who else would call for her? She hurried down the stairs, smoothing her skirts as she went. At the parlor door, she paused, gathering herself, then stepped inside. Gabriel stood by the window, his back to the door, his hat in his hands. He had been wearing his town clothes rather than his trail gear, and his hair was shorter than when he'd left. Evidently, he had made time for a bath and a haircut before coming to see her. "Gabriel," she said softly. He turned at her voice, and the look that came over his face made Lillian's breath catch. Joy, relief, admiration, all these and more crossed his features in an instant, before settling into a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. "Lillian," he said, taking a step toward her, then stopping, suddenly uncertain. "I hope I'm not intruding. We made better time than expected, and I—" He trailed off, his usual confidence faltering. Lillian closed the distance between them, her own smile growing. "You're not intruding. I'm glad you're back." They stood there for a moment, drinking in the sight of each other after so many weeks apart. Then, mindful of Mrs. Hollister's rules and likely watchful eye, Lillian gestured to the settee. "Please sit. Tell me about the drive. Was it successful?" Gabriel sat, placing his hat beside him. "It was. No major incidents, good price for the cattle. Mackenzie's pleased." He hesitated, then added, "Pleased enough that he's offered me a permanent position, as his foreman." Lillian's eyes widened. "Gabriel, that's wonderful." "Foreman is a big responsibility." "It is," he agreed, "and it would mean less time on the trail, more time in one place." His eyes held her steadily. "More time in Abilene." The implication hung in the air between them, full of possibility. "I haven't accepted yet," Gabriel continued when Lillian didn't immediately respond. "I wanted to talk to you first, to see if—" He paused, visibly gathering his courage. "To see if you might consider a more permanent arrangement between us as well." Lillian's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, carved with the same wildflower pattern as the journal he had given her. "I made this," he said, offering it to her. "On the trail. Whittled it by firelight." With trembling fingers, Lillian took the box and opened it. Inside, nestled on a small square of blue fabric, was a ring simple but beautifully crafted, a band of silver with a small pearl at its center. "It's not fancy," Gabriel said, watching her face anxiously. "A cowboy's wages don't stretch to diamonds, but I wanted you to have something that was made just for you, something as unique as you are." Tears blurred Lillian's vision as she looked from the ring to Gabriel's face. "Lillian Morrison," he said solemnly, "these past months have shown me what I think I knew from the first moment I saw you, that you are the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. Your kindness, your courage, the way you've built a new life here in Abilene. It humbles me." He took a deep breath. "I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." For a moment, Lillian couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. All her life, she had been taught by Newton's cruelty that she was unworthy of love, too different, too much. And now this man, this good, kind man who had seen her when no one else would, was offering her not just love but a future together. Gabriel, she finally managed, are you sure? The world isn't kind to differences. People will talk, will stare. Let them, Gabriel interrupted gently. Lillian, I've lived my life on the move, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But with you, for the first time, I want to stay. I want to build something lasting. He smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. Besides, I've never much cared what people think. And you're learning not to either. It was true, Lillian realized. The woman who had left Newton 3 months ago, hunched against the world's judgment, was not the woman sitting here now, holding a proposal of marriage from a man who looked at her as if she were precious beyond measure. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Gabriel Logan, I will marry you. The joy that lit his face was brighter than any sunrise Lillian had ever seen. He took the ring from its box and with a tenderness that belied his calloused hands, slipped it onto her finger. It fits, she said wonderingly. Gabriel's smile turned slightly mischievous. I may have asked Mrs. Chen for help with the size. She was quite enthusiastic about the whole scheme. Lillian laughed, imagining the diminutive dressmaker conspiring with Gabriel. She never said a word. She promised not to, Gabriel said. Though she did tell me that if I didn't treat you right, she knew exactly where to stick her sharpest pins. That made Lillian laugh even harder. It felt good. This laughter free and unself-conscious, shared with the man she loved in a town where she was known not as an object of ridicule but as Lillian Morrison, skilled seamstress, friend, and now bride-to-be. Gabriel glanced toward the parlor door, where Mrs. Hollister could be heard moving about in the hallway. I think our chaperone is getting restless, he said. May I call for you tomorrow? Perhaps we could discuss wedding plans over dinner. Lillian nodded, suddenly shy again. I'd like that. Gabriel stood, reluctantly retrieving his hat. Until tomorrow, then. As he turned to go, Lillian caught his hand. Gabriel, she said softly, thank you. He looked back at her, brow furrowed. For what? For seeing me, she said simply. For helping me see myself. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers where the ring now rested. Always, he promised. For as long as you'll let me. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at Abilene's Methodist Church. Mrs. Chen closed her shop for the day and helped Lillian create a wedding dress that celebrated rather than concealed her figure, ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem, cut to emphasize her strong shoulders and the graceful curve of her waist. Beautiful, Mrs. Chen declared when Lillian tried it on for the final fitting. Like Empress. Sarah stood as Lillian's witness, while Marcus Dolly, who had remained in Abilene as Gabriel's second in command, stood for Gabriel. The church was not full, they had few true friends in Abilene yet. But those who attended came with genuine good wishes, rather than the morbid curiosity that would have marked such an event in Newton. As Lillian walked down the aisle toward Gabriel, who waited for her with undisguised awe on his face, she thought of how far she had come from that day on Newton's Main Street when rocks had struck her back and shame had been her constant companion. Walk with pride, Gabriel had told her then. And now she did not because he had instructed her to, but because she had found within herself the strength to stand tall, to claim her place in the world, to believe herself worthy of the joy that awaited her at the altar. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Gabriel kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar, Lillian knew she had found her true home at last, not in Newton or even in Abilene, but in the love of a man who had seen past the surface to the person she had always been beneath the weight of others' judgments. In the years that followed, Lillian and Gabriel built a life together in Abilene. Gabriel's position as foreman for Mackenzie's outfit provided them with a steady income, enough to rent a small house on the edge of town with a garden that Lillian filled with the same riot of wildflowers that had surrounded her Newton home. Mrs. Chen eventually offered Lillian a partnership in the dress shop, impressed by her skill and her increasingly popular designs for women of all sizes. "You understand," Mrs. Chen said simply. "You make women feel beautiful, not just covered." Word spread, and soon Lillian's creations were sought after not just in Abilene but in neighboring towns as well. She began to employ other seamstresses, teaching them her techniques, insisting that every garment that left their shop must flatter its wearer, must celebrate rather than conceal. Gabriel watched her success with pride, supporting her endeavors with the same unwavering faith he had shown from the beginning. When, 2 years into their marriage, Lillian discovered she was expecting their first child, his joy knew no bounds. "A family," he said in wonder, his hand gentle on her growing belly. "Something I never thought I'd have." Their son, Michael James Logan, was born on a crisp autumn day in 1881, his lusty cries announcing his arrival to the world with the same forthright confidence that would mark his character in the years to come. He had his father's green eyes and his mother's strength, and from the beginning, he was loved with a fierceness that ensured he would never know the kind of rejection that had shaped Lillian's early years. 2 years later, their daughter, Emma Rose, joined the family, bringing with her a quiet thoughtfulness that balanced her brother's exuberance. And in 1885, their youngest, Thomas Gabriel, completed their family a solemn-eyed boy who watched the world with his father's steady gaze and his mother's compassionate heart. Through it all, through the sleepless nights and joyful milestones, through the ordinary challenges of building a life together, Gabriel and Lillian remained each other's steadfast support. They were not perfect, they argued. They misunderstood each other at times. They faced the same struggles as any couple. But beneath these ordinary frictions ran a current of absolute acceptance, of seeing and being seen, that had been born on that dusty street in Newton when a cowboy had told a mistreated woman to walk with pride. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gabriel surprised Lillian with a deed to a small property on the outskirts of Abilene, 5 acres with a modest house that needed work, but had good bones and ample space for a growing family. "Our own place," he said, watching her face as she read the document. "No more renting, something to pass on to the children someday." Lillian looked up from the deed, tears shimmering in her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch of their rented house, Gabriel's arm around Lillian's shoulders as they looked up at the stars that had guided him home to her so many times over the years. "Did you ever imagine we'd come this far?" Lillian asked softly. "That day in Newton when you first spoke to me," Gabriel was quiet for a moment, considering. "I knew you were special," he finally said. "I knew you deserved better than what that town gave you, but this—" He gestured to encompass their home, their sleeping children, the life they had built together. "This exceeds every dream I ever had." Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never thought possible before Gabriel had entered her life. "I used to think happiness wasn't meant for people like me," she admitted. "That I was too different, too much." "You are different," Gabriel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're extraordinary, and that's exactly why I love you." Lillian smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought them here from a cruel town where rocks had been thrown at her back to this moment of perfect peace beside the man who had taught her that her differences were not flaws to be hidden, but strengths to be celebrated. "Walk with pride," she murmured, the words that had once been a challenge now a simple statement of how she moved through the world. "Always," Gabriel agreed, his voice a promise in the darkness. And she did through all the years that followed, through the joys and sorrows that make up any life. Lillian Morrison Logan walked with her head high, her heart full, and her steps sure, knowing herself to be exactly who she was meant to be, loved exactly as she was. In 1903, when Lillian was 47 and Gabriel 55, they received an unexpected letter from Newton, Kansas. The town's mayor, a man named Jefferson Davis, no relation to the Confederate president, as he was apparently fond of pointing out, had written to invite them to Newton's Founding Day celebration. "Your family's long history in the area," the letter read, "and your success as a businesswoman make you an honored guest, Mrs. Logan. Newton would be proud to welcome you home." Lillian sat at their kitchen table, the letter spread before her, a wry smile playing at her lips. 25 years, she said to Gabriel, who was reading over her shoulder. 25 years, and suddenly Newton is proud of me. Gabriel snorted. Convenient timing. Now that your designs are sold in Kansas City and Denver, now that your name appears in fashion journals, now they want to claim you. Their oldest son, Michael, now 22, and working alongside his father in the cattle business, looked up from his breakfast. "You're not considering going, are you, Ma?" Lillian tapped the letter thoughtfully. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Part of me wants to say no, to tell them exactly what I think of their sudden change of heart." She looked out the window toward her garden, where wildflowers still grew in profusion among more practical vegetables. But another part wonders what it would be like to walk down Main Street again, not as the girl they tormented, but as the woman I've become. Gabriel pulled out a chair and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. The years had added silver to his sandy hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but he still looked at her with the same clear, steady gaze that had first caught her attention in Newton all those years ago. "Whatever you decide," he said, "I'll support you. But remember, you don't owe them anything, not your presence, not your forgiveness, nothing." Lillian squeezed his hand gratefully. "I know, I'll think about it." In the end, curiosity won out over resentment. 6 weeks later, Lillian and Gabriel, along with their 3 children, stepped off the train in Newton, Kansas for the first time in a quarter century. The town had changed, grown larger, more prosperous, with brick buildings replacing some of the wooden structures Lillian remembered. But much remained the same. The dusty Main Street, the church steeple visible from the station, the wide open sky above the prairie. As they made their way to the hotel where they would stay during the 3-day celebration, Lillian was acutely aware of the stares that followed them. But these were different from the looks she had endured in her youth. These held curiosity, recognition, even admiration. "Mrs. Logan," a voice called from across the street. A woman hurried toward them, her face alight with welcome. It took Lillian a moment to recognize Widow Jenkins, now well into her 70s but still spry. "You came. When the mayor said he'd invited you, I hardly dared hope you'd accept." "Mrs. Jenkins," Lillian said warmly, surprised by the genuine pleasure she felt at seeing her former neighbor. "It's good to see you." "And these must be your children," Mrs. Jenkins exclaimed, looking at Michael, Emma, and Thomas with undisguised interest. "My, they're fine-looking young people." Introductions were made, and Mrs. Jenkins insisted on walking with them to the hotel, filling Lillian in on 25 years of Newton gossip along the way. Most of the names meant little to Lillian now. The connections faded with time and distance. But she listened politely, struck by how different it felt to walk these streets as a visitor rather than an outcast. The Founding Day celebration began the following morning with a parade down Main Street. The mayor had asked Lillian to ride in the lead carriage as a guest of honor, but she had declined, preferring to watch with her family from the boardwalk. She stood tall beside Gabriel, her head high, wearing one of her own designs, a deep blue dress that complemented her still vibrant figure, now softened by motherhood and middle age. As the parade passed, Lillian found herself scanning the faces in the crowd, looking for anyone she might recognize from her former life. There were a few Mrs. Peterson, now bent with age, Mr. Collins, who had been deputy to Sheriff Blackburn, and surprisingly, Hank Pritchard himself. He was middle-aged now, his once handsome face thickened by drink and hard living. When his gaze met Lillian's across the street, a flicker of recognition passed over his features, followed by something that might have been shame. He looked away quickly, moving deeper into the crowd. "You see something," Gabriel murmured, noticing her distraction. "Someone from the past," Lillian replied. "It doesn't matter now," and she realized with mild surprise that it truly didn't. The hatred and cruelty that had once defined her existence in Newton now seemed distant, almost belonging to another person's life. She had built something so much richer, so much more meaningful in the years since she'd left. The final event of the celebration was a dinner at the newly built town hall, where Lillian found herself seated at the head table with the mayor and other distinguished guests. Before the meal, Mayor Davis rose to make a speech, praising Newton's progress and the contributions of its citizens both past and present. "And we are particularly honored," he said, gesturing to Lillian, "to welcome home one of Newton's most successful daughters, Mrs. Lillian Logan, whose designs are now celebrated throughout the West." Polite applause followed, and Lillian inclined her head in acknowledgement, feeling Gabriel's supportive presence beside her. "Mrs. Logan has graciously agreed to say a few words," the mayor continued. To Lillian's surprise, she had agreed to no such thing. But as all eyes turned to her, Lillian found herself rising to her feet, drawn by some impulse she didn't fully understand. She looked out over the assembled faces, some curious, some admiring, some old enough to remember the girl she had been and the way they had treated her. "Thank you, Mayor Davis," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It's interesting to be back in Newton after so many years." A ripple of appreciative laughter passed through the crowd at her careful choice of words. "When I left here 25 years ago," Lillian continued, "I was running from something, from the cruelty of a town that could not see past appearances to the person beneath." She paused, seeing a few heads lower in discomfort. "But I've discovered in returning that I'm not that frightened girl anymore, and Newton is not entirely the same town." She glanced at Gabriel, drawing strength from his proud smile, then back at the crowd. "We all change, given time and opportunity. We all grow. Sometimes we even learn to see each other more clearly, more kindly." She gestured to her children, seated at a nearby table. "I've taught my children that a person's worth lies not in how they look or where they come from, but in how they treat others, in the kindness and respect they show to all people, regardless of differences." Lillian's gaze swept the room, noting the attentive faces, the nods of agreement. "If Newton has learned something similar in the years since I left, then perhaps it truly has progressed beyond the boardwalks and buildings." She raised her glass in a toast. "To Newton's future, may it be built on understanding rather than judgment, on kindness rather than cruelty, on seeing people for who they truly are rather than for what they appear to be." A moment of silence followed her words, then the room erupted in applause, genuine, heartfelt applause that brought unexpected tears to Lillian's eyes. As she sat down, Gabriel leaned close. "Proud of you," he whispered. "Always have been, always will be." Later that night, after the dinner had ended and their children had retired to their rooms, Lillian and Gabriel walked through the quiet streets of Newton. Without discussion, their steps led them to Cedar Street, to the small house with what had once been a blue door, now painted a cheerful yellow. "It looks well kept," Gabriel observed as they stood at the gate, looking at the house that had been Lillian's prison and refuge for so many years. Lillian nodded. "Mrs. Jenkins told me a young couple bought it about 10 years ago. They have 3 children now." She smiled at the thought of the house filled with life and laughter, the shadows of her lonely years there replaced by a family's love. "You regret leaving?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Ever?" Lillian turned to him, taking in the beloved face that had aged alongside her own, the green eyes that still looked at her with the same admiration and love they had shown from the beginning. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Gabriel smiled, drawing her close in the deepening twilight. "Walk with pride," he murmured against her hair. "Always," Lillian replied, her voice a promise in the darkness. Together they turned away from the house on Cedar Street, walking back toward their hotel, toward their children, toward the life they had built far from Newton's narrow confines. And with each step, Lillian felt the last tendrils of old pain release their hold on her heart, replaced by gratitude for the journey that had brought her here to this moment, to this man, to the woman she had become. The woman who walked with pride,